What is it they are trying to say with this game, I pondered.
Slave mines?
Basically felt a lot like being British. I was recently listening to an episode of Jacob Geller and Blake Hester's excellent Something Rotten podcast, when Jacob mentioned being a big fan of the game Dishonored, and it reminded me of the fact that I'd never actually finished it. I think I'd played through around 75% before, but it got my brain firing, and after my Dredge video was finished, I was looking for another game that I could sink my teeth into. So I played through a largely non-lethal, low chaos run, killing bad, and remembered why this game is held in such high regard. So I played through it again, this time as a bloodthirsty killing machine, and got the high chaos ending.
I'll flush you out.
I discovered that the benefit of killing every living creature for miles is that you get to explore the world around you at your leisure, listening to every audio clip, reading every book, and really getting invested in what is a fascinating setting. Part steampunk, part Victoriana, and with a genuinely interesting way of seeing your playstyle affect the world over time. However, there was one thing that bothered me. I was playing as the Empress's boyfriend, father of the heir and royal protector Corvo Attano, and the goal of everything I was doing was not to alleviate the suffering of the poor, the sick and the hungry. I was not fighting for equality nor freedom. I was seeking to restore the rightful heir, my daughter, to the throne, a return to the status quo. A status quo that didn't really seem to be doing very much for a lot of the people of the Empire. That rankled a little. The knowledge that this awesome experience was throwing all these fascinating things at me, but all it ultimately meant was the continuation of systemic exploitation, suffering and violence by virtue of a largely hereditary colonial empire. It basically felt a lot like being British, actually. What is it they are trying to say with this game, I pondered. And so I got out my notepad and started looking at the setup of the empire, its people, its institutions, and the game's themes to try and better understand Dishonored from a left-wing point of view. So this video will be focusing on the first game and its DLCs in the main, albeit with bits of info and footage that I have gleaned from the second game and the excellent Dishonored wiki. What follows will be a look at the setting and the world of Dishonored, an examination of the 5 institutional powers underpinning the Empire, a brief look at the plot, an examination of the main characters you interact with, and some consideration of the game in the wider context of video games, politics and left-wing storytelling. Don your gear, comrades, we're going exploring. We will begin by looking at the world that the game is based in, and examine some of the notable elements. This is doubly important, since as well as being relevant to my wider discussion, the world building is one of the strongest aspects of the game, and frankly this is something that is often neglected in most modern games in my personal experience. Arcane, as a developer, have a great track record of this kind of thing, having built and presented the worlds of Wolfenstein, Prey, and of course the Dishonored series, showing that they have a pedigree for creating worlds rich in detail and deep in content. So the quality of the setting is no great surprise to anyone, except maybe the ZeniMax executives who force Arcane to stop making single player games and instead make multiplayer shooters like Redfall. How's that going? Before we take our first steps into an actually good game, please consider liking this video if you're enjoying it so far. It really helps to get it out to others and to let me know that I'm doing the right sort of thing, the sort of thing that people want to be seeing. So yeah, give it a like if you got a second. Dishonored is a first-person immersive sim with an approach to game design that rewards exploration and investment in the world. It attempts to create a multiple path adventure where the player can choose their own approach to each problem and can influence the world around them through their actions, as opposed to the usual option wheel, good or bad decision making of the other RPGs we often think of. The Dishonored series of games take place in a Victoriana steampunk setting that is seemingly 99% ocean, with the exception of the Isles, a collection of small land masses where a facsimile of Western humanity has settled, and Pandysia, an allegedly uncivilized and wild continent that seems to resist all Imperial attempts to colonize it thus far. The Emperor or Empress of the Isles, who acts as the primary ruler, decides the parliamentary agenda, but Parliament has the final power to pass or deny the acts of the Empress from what I can see, though it is not always abundantly clear exactly how that institutional relationship works. Needless to say, both are required for a functioning nation. The Parliament operates like a corporation, with a number of noble families making up the voting blocks, with their voting power relating directly to their wealth and influence. In this way, the power is largely hereditary, with voting power passed from generation to generation. The monarch and Parliament make up two sides of what I interpret as a five-sided balance of power that decides the fate of those under them, the other three being the Void, an alternate plane of existence and the source of all magic, presided over by the Outsider, a supernatural avatar that personifies the Void and provides power and wisdom to those that pique their interest, without ever really revealing their end goals or desires. You have the Abbey of the Everyman, a religious order that manages the moral character of the Empire, ensures that civil society doesn't stray far from established cultural norms, and persecutes worship of the outsider as heresy. You also have the military. While nominally under the instruction of the Empress and Parliament, they hold their own institutional power, much as they do in real life, with their remit extending to both policing the city streets and, of course, the Imperial Navy. Now, it is important to note that there is no institutional power or representation for ordinary people in this balance. They do not appear to be represented democratically, and there does not appear to be any organised representation encountered in my time in the game so far, with a few small exceptions. There is some industrial action, and a few references to the activity of unions, particularly in the Knife of Dunwall DLC, so there is some understanding of collectivism and the power of class solidarity, though unions appear to be under pressure from the state during the actual time of the game. Economically, the seat of the Empire, Gristol, relies quite heavily on whaling for food and fuel at least, and seems to have a lot of traditional Victorian era industry, with mining and shipping sitting with what is a largely ocean-based power. There is mention of the other islands that make up the Empire having their own specialities, whether it be Morley's fruits or Tivia's valuable mineral deposits, but usually it's only mentioned with reference to their value to Gristol and the wider Empire. Dunwall is the capital of Gristol, and this is where the main game takes place. It's very much a Victorian London vibe, overlaid with a bit of steampunk and whale oil tech. The ordinary citizens that are encountered in the game are often only seen in context with the ongoing Gristol Plague, but they appear to have largely traditional working class roles from the Victorian period, such as cleaners, servants, scavengers, peddlers, tradespeople and factory workers. There are also militaristic roles in Dunwall, fulfilled by the City Guard and the Abbey's overseers, acting as civic and moral police respectively, with the City Guard acting as the primary law-keeping force on behalf of the Empress or Regent. Both are open to hiring the working class, and in fact the City Guard even recruits from the prisons. You will occasionally encounter officers that are recruited from wealthier families and act as both detectives and protectors of the aristocratic families. The poorer citizens of Dunwall have to rely on an entirely lower tier of guard for their protection though, naturally. So now that we have a feeling for Dunwall and the wider world, let's have a closer look at the powers that dominate the Empire and what their relationship is like with the ordinary people of the Isles.
What business are you talking about?
Oh, grown-up business, girl. I mean, your ladyship. Forgive me.
It's okay. I heard a lot of grown-up business on the Golden Cat.
Oh, I should concentrate on piloting this boat.
What is abundantly clear in the first game is that whilst there may be political actors that claim to be representing ordinary people and their interests, there seems to be no legitimate route for the populace to make their feelings known, or any way to directly express any desire for change. There are occasional mentions of workplace resistance, which at least suggests that class solidarity must exist in some form, but they do not appear to be one of the major powers vying for control of the Empire, which suggests it may be a somewhat fragmented or neutered version of unionisation.
Job. Stilton made sure of it. No one got fired for being injured.
Yeah, so they say. The mining office handled things like that. And the family committee made sure that the bosses never got too greedy.
Kind of a stalemate. Everything worked as long as one side didn't win out over the other. And that's exactly what happened once Stilton disappeared.
We mentioned earlier that there are effectively 5 powers that determine life for those under them, and that they exist in a constantly evolving tension, with each vying to control a bigger slice of the Empire. Let's have a closer look at each of them and see their real-life parallels, and their viability for working-class political agency in Dunwall, and indeed the wider Empire. Starting with Parliament. Parliament appears to work as if it is a corporation, with power distributed out to representatives based upon their family's wealth and influence, with their voting power passing to their next of kin when they die. In the first game, Dishonored, you assassinate or neutralise the elder Pendleton brothers, and their combined voting power passes to their surviving younger brother. It is perhaps conceivable that a family could, if it could create enough wealth or influence, be apportioned some amount of voting power, though I should imagine there is a natural conservatism to the way that this parliament operates, couched as it is in the aristocracy. Aristocratic class interests would act as a barrier against too many new powers growing unchecked. In terms of a real-world equivalent, politics worldwide is largely a closed shop for those from wealthier families. But more specifically, I see the UK's House of Lords being the direct inspiration, with the hereditary passing of roles being a big part of its history, and its present. Indeed, according to Wikipedia, the hereditary peers form part of the peerage in the United Kingdom. As of April 2023, there are 806 hereditary peers, 30 dukes, 34 marquises, 189 earls, 110 viscounts, and 443 barons. So I mean, it's still kind of applicable even now, which is... it's a bit tragic really. The interests of the average parliamentarian in the Empire of the Isles will be far removed from those of the lower classes, and I suspect that whilst there may be a few with good intentions, the majority that we encounter are very much looking after their own interests first and their class interests second. I would estimate public interest is probably somewhere in the teens in terms of priority, right after restoring the Draper Street tailoring district to its pre-plague standards. A bit of a deep cut from the second game. The Abbey of the Everyman. The Abbey of the Everyman is an interesting organisation that acts as a sort of militaristic arbiter of morality, a sort of social reproductive policing, ensuring that the virtues considered acceptable by their leadership are reinforced first with speech and then with violence. During the course of the first game, you encounter an overseer named Martin. Overseer essentially being a religious cop. Martin works with your group to strategise against those that usurp the Empress at the beginning of the game, and if you use the Heart item, which is a paranormal tool that gives you mystical insights into things, it will tell you that he was once both a highwayman and a soldier before becoming an overseer. This suggests that perhaps the Abbey of the Everyman is a way for ordinary people to gain some institutional power, if they can rise high enough. That being said, there is a familiar structure to the way that the Abbey decides who will become the High Overseer, and effectively define the policy of the organisation.
I agree. A whore dies and suddenly this. Will you have... What?
Upon the death of the High Overseer, a council of Elder Overseers locks itself away to begin a long and elaborate process of selecting the next one. If that sounds at all familiar, then yes, it is rather similar to the way that the Pope is selected by the Catholic Church, isn't it? I think we are starting to understand the role that the Abbey plays in the Isles, although hopefully with less noncing. The power and the influence of the Abbey seems to ebb and flow over the course of the games, but they are certainly powerful enough to command a decent-sized urban military force and act as a sort of inquisition that is largely independent of the other institutions. The monarchy. I mean, obviously there is no route for ordinary people to find power via the monarchy, short of marrying into it or some sort of coup, wink, but undermining an institution is not the same as using it to represent ordinary people in its current form. With that in mind then, we must accept that it is an institution that is diametrically opposed to the increase in station that would be sought by its citizens, as any gains in freedom or wealth that the lower classes gained would impact on the power and controls of the ruling classes. The first two games do attempt to offer instances of the Emperor or some of the monarchs of the individual isles being popular and attempting to do right by those under them, but this feels similar to the way we talk of billionaire philanthropy, where we would frankly much prefer you weren't maintaining a structure that requires our suffering, rather than just helping people when it suits you. There is a brief exchange in Dishonored 2 between artist, intellectual and inventor Anton Sokolov to the then deposed Empress Emily Kaldwin that I think nails this reality rather succinctly.
Drives the mine crews night and day. Dust falls non-stop onto the district. What was once prosperous is now in ruins.
I suppose the Duke doesn't care, as long as he sips from silver cups.
And what are the cups at Dunwall Tower made from, Empress?
Waiting for a benevolent dictator is an occupation for fools and the bourgeoisie, because you will get plenty of the latter, but rarely any of the former, the military. The Imperial military seems to be mostly a naval affair, which makes sense given the geography of the region, though each island appears to have at least some autonomy to run their own armed forces, and it is also referenced that those wealthy enough can effectively commandeer military forces for their own requirements. The military, like the other big institutions, has several barriers to working class people ascending past a certain stage, which is a parallel to real life too, where those who go to the right schools and come from the right families get to enter the military as officers. It is certainly not inconceivable that an ordinary citizen could work their way up to a position of relative power, though one suspects that any citizen with a desire for real change would struggle to ascend the greasy pole in the first place, mirroring Chomsky's famous response to BBC journalist Andrew Marr's claim that no one told him what to say.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you
I
know
don't say
that
you're
journalists
self-censoring. I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
The Outsider and the Void. The Void is the wild card in all this.
Why aren't the brakes working? Because I cut the brakes! Wild card! What?
The Void and its avatar the Outsider play a more subtle game, and it's one that seems beyond the simple power struggles of the Empire, most of the time.
Half the city can see the lights from the party, and they dream of the delights inside. Will you tear it all to pieces?
The Outsider allows the death of an Empress, but then empowers our masked Avenger to return the rightful heir to the throne, describing events as little more than entertainment in an almost Loki-like way. There are multiple references to the Void as a form of afterlife or purgatory, as well as a sort of mirrored dimension, but it mostly just exists to provide exposition and a cool place to view static dioramas of ongoing events in the Empire. The Outsider themselves seems to care little about any life, rich or poor, and is seemingly politically aloof, so not much use to us here. So that's our 5 pillars of the Empire. So I suppose we'd better talk about what actually happens in Dishonored, really.
How can a gang of cutthroats believe they represent the citizens of Karnaca?
Do you think the Grand Guard is keeping the city safe? For everybody not born in a palace, sometimes a gang of cutthroats is all we've got.
In Dishonored, the first game, you are Corvo, royal protector and secret lover of the Empress and father of the heir, Emily. Now I should say secret, with the inverted commas, since you can find several diaries from key members of the royal court, and they pretty much all know Emily is Corvo's daughter. Dunwall is gripped by a rat-based plague, and Corvo has returned from an attempt to request help from the other nation-states of the Empire with no success. He returns in time to see the Empress assassinated in front of him, his daughter kidnapped, and then to be accused of assassinating the Empress himself.
What did you do with young Lady Emily, traitor?
Her own bodyguard. Ironic.
I'll see you beheaded for this, Corvo.
Corvo is then imprisoned for around 6 months, pending a public execution, before being helped to escape by a group of loyalists, who then ask him to neutralise a series of targets and rescue Emily in order to restore the rightful heir to the throne, which is currently being ruled over by a Lord Regent named Hiram Burrows, who incidentally was the one who orchestrated both the assassination and Corvo's framing for it. So the main game begins, and you encounter the Outsider, who empowers Corvo with his mark, which allows him to use magical abilities as he goes about his mission, though the Outsider's reasons for doing so are not exactly clear. How bloodthirsty you are as you play the game determines a number of factors, but essentially, You grow Corvo's supernatural powers, you eliminate your targets, you return Emily to your base, and then... Corvo is poisoned by his alleged comrades, and his body is dumped in a river.
Corvo has breathed his last, just as you wanted.
You've done a fine job.
Remember, we need the body. If we come forward with the corpse of the man who murdered the Empress, we'll be greeted as heroes.
Yes, it'll grant us legitimacy. We'll be the men who rescued Emily and brought down the Lord Regent and his assassin.
Corvo and a bunch of supporting characters are targeted for execution by the leaders of the Loyalists, with an eye to claiming it was they who found and rescued Emily from that horrid assassin, that being you, Corvo, making them heroes and putting them in key positions of power, and nobody will ask any questions as to how they knew where Emily was, etc, etc. The rest of the game then revolves around saving Emily again and choosing some form of justice for your former co-conspirators. So, why did these seemingly sound characters decide to take these heinous actions after spending so long criticising exactly these behaviours when enacted by Burroughs and his coterie? We're going to talk about that right now.
He won't get past me, sir. Do you know who we're hunting here? Don't try to take him out alone.
But what if no one from the squad is around?
Then try to make a lot of noise when you die. Knock something over if you can.
Bastard.
It's really hot. It's a bad idea. Bad time to be wearing a waistcoat. Before I continue with filming the second half of this video, can I please remind you that if you're enjoying this video, please take a second to give it a like. It tells YouTube that there might be something worth watching here and will help push it out to more people. Thank you. The targets you are sent to neutralise throughout the course of the game are essentially the key personnel of the coup that removed the Empress, and each one represents one of the 5 pillars of power that we discussed earlier, and is effectively mirrored by one of the Loyalists. The existence of archetypal similarities between the coup's traitors and the Loyalist group is not the only similarity we will find as we look at these characters in a little more detail. And ultimately, I think we will begin to understand why it is that when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. First up, we have the military pillar, which is commanded directly by the Lord Regent in the absence of an Empress or Emperor, and in this case that is Hiram Burroughs, the former spymaster and generally creepy fash bastard. Burroughs is feared and detested by the ordinary folk of the Empire, who view him as an authoritarian that wields the powers of the state for his own interests, and that unleashes the brutal persecution of both the city guard and the overseers onto the streets of Dunwall to create his own vision of order. Burroughs was the mastermind behind the coup, and it is revealed through the literature within the game that it was he that secretly introduced the rat plague to the poorer districts in an attempt to reduce the numbers of poor people, whom he viewed as undesirable, unproductive, and chaotic. This goes hand in hand with what we learn about Hiram Burroughs throughout the game. He was obsessed with order and discipline, and was displeased with the former Empress and her approach to governing. He was a fascist. Like many on the political right, he judged others by his own treacherous standards, seeing threats and dangers everywhere, when the irony was that he was the snake. In the Loyalists, the ringleader is former Admiral Farley Havelock, previously of the Imperial Navy, who was removed from duty after attempting to take over the military after the death of the Empress. What's important to note is that this is not a detail shared by Havelock, but is instead provided by the game's single best item, the Heart, which reveals lore and info on characters that they themselves would not reveal. The fact he was ready to attempt a military coup so quickly after the assassination is of interest, and goes to show the power and influence he clearly possessed in the military. Havelock presents himself as a tough but wise leader, and a patriot, early on at least, though there are glimpses that he is perhaps not as good a person as he claims, particularly if you read his logs or ask the heart item about him. The heart says these 3 things that add to our understanding of his character. He has killed whales and men for profit and pleasure. He has the bloodlust. He tried to seize control of the military after the Empress, after she was murdered. Admiral Havelock has seen more corpses than all the rest put together. It would appear that he is not the calm arbiter for justice that he presents as, and the signs were there for those willing to see. Samuel Beechworth, the only other loyalist that regularly has to risk heading into dangerous areas on his boat, and bit of a dude to be honest, mentions at one point that he served under Havelock during a previous conflict, but that Havelock appears to not recognise him. It is perhaps not fair to expect someone to remember every person they come into contact with in the line of their work, but the fact it is remarked upon at all is surely to point out that Havelock looks up and forward, but not back and down. Ultimately, both Havelock and Burroughs come from a violent institutional power, and both masterminded a coup that led to the suffering of those around them. Burroughs out of a desire to see a stronger, more authoritarian state, and Havelock out of an alleged loyalty to the rightful heir, though that would later seem to be forgotten once the chance to take over as regent becomes real. In the low chaos ending, or effectively the non-lethal storyline, Havelock first has all of the working class staff murdered and then later poisons his co-conspirators, suggesting that he perhaps shares the same problem as Burroughs and begins projecting his own treacherous and greedy desires onto those around him, necessitating that he protects himself by removing all threats, all in the name of the Empire, of course. Those that desire the ultimate power are often the least well equipped to use it, or so conventional wisdom goes, anyway. During the course of the game, the Loyalists identify a need to control Parliament, in an attempt to restrict the powers and funding of the Lord Regent, Hiram Burroughs, and so Trevor Pendleton, the Loyalist aristocrat and wannabe parliamentarian, suggests the assassination of his 2 older brothers, so that the Pendleton share of the votes in Parliament would pass to him, allowing him to cut off the Regent's parliamentary support and funding. The Pendleton twins, Morgan and Custis, as the eldest living Pendletons, control the family's votes in Parliament, inhabit the family manor, and run the family business, that being the slave mines. So yeah, this family are the worst. The information you find out about them in the game suggests that they are interested in little other than pursuing pleasure and spend a lot of time at the Golden Cat, a high-end brothel, pursuing debauchery and hedonistic entertainment. It is interesting to discover then that the supposedly more morally upstanding Trevor Pendleton, the one looking down his nose at his brothers, the Loyalist aristocrat, also frequents this establishment regularly, though he is less open about it than his brothers. In fact, the more that we discover about Loyalist Trevor, the more similar he becomes to his brothers, and it should be noted that of the Loyalists he probably gains the most in terms of power and wealth. The Pendletons are old money, and their family was one of those to found Dunwall itself, the capital of the Empire, so one wonders how much change would be allowed by such a power. How open to progress can these interests be? Ultimately, you are able to, if you want to, deliver the Pendleton twins to a gang leader named Slackjaw in the game, and he shaves their heads, removes their tongues, in order to put them to work in their own mines, which for me scores quite highly in the ironic punishment column.
See that? Slackjaw keeps a bargain, just as good as the men who run the city. Maybe a little better. You think about that.
In the low chaos ending, as previously mentioned, Trevor gets poisoned by Havelock in order to protect himself from any future blackmail potential. And in the high chaos ending, Trevor is killed in an internal conflict between himself, Havelock, and Martin in a fight over who gets to control Emily as regent. There is something reassuring that there was something of a fitting end for Trevor Pendleton either way. But as with Burroughs and Havelock, whichever Pendleton ends up at the steering wheel, it seems to make very little difference for the ordinary people of the Isles. One of the original coup members, Thaddeus Campbell, is High Overseer and the leader of the Abbey and its significant military and cultural power. Thaddeus is far from a model religious figure, and there is a hidden chamber that can be found in his home, which reveals he has also been known to frequent the Golden Cat and make use of its facilities, which is not something his faith would allow. My favourite game item, the Heart, has this to say about the man. He breaks each of the 7 strictures daily. It is his own private joke. It is also mentioned at one point that he only gained the position of High Overseer through blackmail, and that he has had several courtesans murdered when he suspected they might try to blackmail him. He is not a good guy, needless to say.
I don't understand how this got so unpleasant.
Oh, I agree. A whore dies and suddenly this. Will you have...
His opposite number in the Loyalist group is Teague Martin, a former overseer and now the Loyalists' own strategist. Martin was described by the Heart as being a former outlaw and soldier, and other info on him regards him as being a silver-tongued and quick-witted survivor, which explains how he was able to get into the Overseers despite his background. He is the only one of the Loyalist leaders that ever expresses any real regret over the betrayal of Corvo, and the decision to murder their staff, though to be clear, he was party to the decision and the execution of it. In the low chaos ending, Martin is poisoned along with Pendleton by a paranoid Havelock, and in the high chaos ending, Martin is warring with the others and attempting to gain control of Emily. He is described by multiple characters as a snake, and any claims he made to having good intentions or doing things for the cause appear to melt away when compared with his actions and choices. Who's worse of Campbell and Martin? Almost undoubtedly Campbell. But again, Martin as High Overseer doesn't feel like a change that would reach the lives of those on the lower rungs of society somehow. Whoever ends up wearing the title of High Overseer will have lied to get there and killed to stay there. The Outsider and the Void do not really function in the same way as the other pillars, seeing as how they do not really concern themselves with conventional institutional power, or in the scramble for the throne. At most, they are like the kid putting 2 ants in a bucket and making them fight, indifferent to all but the spectacle itself. Nonetheless, the coup's assassin, Dowd, and the Loyalists' Corvo do act to continue the mirror image across faction lines, so we will explore the similarities out of interest, even if it doesn't necessarily further the class argument in this instance. Dowd is a hired assassin, and like Corvo, he is favoured by the Outsider, meaning he gains supernatural abilities similar to Corvo. He is hired by Hiram Burrows to kill the Empress as part of the coup, which he does, despite the best efforts of Corvo at the time. Dowd is an interesting character and is playable in the DLCs for the first game, Knife of Dunwall and the Brigmore Witches, where we discover that he is politically a neutral character, acting only in return for money, up until the assassination of the Empress anyway. He was born at sea to a Pandician mother and a pirate father, before growing up as a criminal and assassin in the cities of Serkonos and eventually Dunwall. Dowd is a powerful entity in his own right, but as someone of lower class birth, he is treated as an expendable tool by his employers, and reviled as much as he is feared in high society for his willingness to get his own hands bloody. The rich and powerful use him to remove rivals regularly, and Dowd himself acknowledges that he often works for one aristocrat before then killing them when hired by the previous victim's family. Dowd's fate is decided by the player as Corvo in the main game, though the canon result is that Corvo spares him, allowing him to feature in the DLCs and sequels. Corvo, like Dowd, comes from Serkonos, and from a lower class background, and it was his abilities with a sword that earned him a route out of poverty and put him in the path of Jessamine, who was then daughter of the Emperor. Where Dowd navigated his own path via the shadows and gold coin, Corvo got lucky enough to find love and a place of privilege via the right side of the law. One can speculate as to whether Dowd would have been different should his life's path have encountered such a boon, but ultimately these characters share a number of similarities, including what feels like an indifference to the lives of ordinary people at times, whether it be through the jaded, blood-stained mind of Dowd or the privileged and revenge-driven Corvo. Both have the capacity to care for others, but have a tendency to be manipulated and used by the upper classes, forgetting that to some, your class is where you were born and not where you exist right now. Don't press the wrong button. Emily doesn't really have a counterpart, other than perhaps the Lord Regent, but her position is largely astride both the coup plotters and the Loyalists, since her role is the same in either scenario. Whether we consider her as being manipulated by Hiram Burrows or Farley Havelock as Lord Regent, neither fills me with much confidence when it comes to imagining how the situation for the ordinary people of the Empire might improve. Even if Emily grows into her own person and rules seemingly kindly like her mother, it simply prolongs the status quo, with the poor working dangerous jobs in bad conditions, unrepresented and maligned for their very living conditions. Empress Jessamine Caldwin, the murdered Empress and Emily's mother, was reasonably popular, it seems, but we have to acknowledge that the Pendleton Slave Company was trading under her rule. The whale oil trade was openly abusing its workers, and the City Watch and overseers were already using their power to mistreat the poorer elements of society. To add a bit more to this specific point, we will dip into some parts of the DLC in Dishonored 2 here. For example, in Dishonored 2, we encounter the story of Aramis Stilton, a miner that managed to buy control of his own mines, and who spent vast time and resources on building equipment to make mining safer for his workers, who were previously dying en masse from the gases and particles inherent in the silver mining process. This work appears to be self-funded, suggesting that it was only the first-hand experience of Stilton that led to these measures being implemented at all. In the Knife of Dunwall DLC, we see working conditions in the whale processing plants of the Empire, which are undergoing strikes due to the way that workers are treated, and I quote, like prison labour gangs. And it is mentioned somewhere, though I can't find where now, that children also worked roles in these plants. This all happened under Jessamina's rule, alongside Corvo. In Dishonored 2, you can play as either an older Corvo or a grown-up Empress Emily, and in my first playthrough I went for Emily, as frankly Corvo's a bit boring as a character. Emily shows a repeated blind spot for her own privilege, and even when forced to face poverty, disease, violence and exploitation, she still returns to a position of exceptionalism, of being destined for rule, despite often complaining of having to face the tedium necessitated by a position of power. As pointed out by Maris Crane in her excellent article Dissecting Dishonored 2 on Medium, linked in the description, an option to end this monarchic system would have been welcome, considering that Emily embodies one of its biggest flaws. What if the monarch doesn't want to rule and consequently doesn't do a good job of it? So where does this leave us? We have representation of the key institutions both in the coup plotters and the loyalists, and they become essentially interchangeable when viewed in terms of their impact on wider society. But there is one key point here to all of this, one factor that connects all of them, with the possible exception of Corvo and Daud, that factor being class. Whether via the imbued power of an institution, the influence and wealth of heritage, or the strength of reputation, these characters are all of a similar class, except for Corvo and Daud, who are still more tools than associates as far as the others are concerned. How do we know this? Well, let us consider the wider loyalist movement based out of the Hound's Pit pub owned by Havelock. You have Havelock, Pendleton and Martin acting as a leadership team, supported by Corvo, Pendleton's servant Wallace Higgins, Emily's tutor Callista Kernow, Cecilia, a servant at the pub, Lydia Brooklyn, the pub's former hostess, Samuel Beechworth, the boatman, and then the inventors Piero Joplin and Anton Sokolov. So why do we suppose that the leadership team is as it is? Surely certifiable geniuses like Joplin and Sokolov would have had the intellect for decision making. Beechworth served under Havelock in the Navy and has decades of practical experience. Lydia Brooklyn talks of her connections and knowledge of the underworld, which would no doubt prove very useful. Yet it would appear that if you were a servant, underling or assistant in your career, so would you be in the loyalist movement, in spite of skills, in spite of knowledge, in spite of experience. You yourself played Corvo, a supernatural assassin, capable of tremendous acts of violence, stealth and subterfuge, and a former royal protector, and yet you are never asked what you think should happen. Once Emily is rescued, and the Lord Regent Hiram Burrows, I do love that name, removed from power, Havelock, Pendleton and Martin decide that to reveal they were involved in a long-term conspiracy involving public enemy number 1 Corvo would be too risky. So they decide to just murder everyone that they consider both expendable and of no longer use to them. Higgins, Brooklyn and Kernow are all murdered. Cecilia escapes only because she is beneath their notice and forgotten about, and the inventors manage to lock themselves away to avoid capture, as they are still considered useful. Corvo is poisoned and only survives because Beechworth halves the dose he was ordered to give him in order to save his life, before he himself escapes, having correctly identified that he would be the next on the chopping block. Lives were severed neatly along class lines, reinforcing that it matters little to the slave who holds the whip so long as they remain the slave. The loyalist leadership trio later tried to justify their actions as necessary, but this is language we have heard before, whether it be in periods of state austerity or even after instances of state violence. It's still the ordinary people that suffer, regardless of the reasoning and rhetoric, and that is no accident. When considering how you could change the world around you in a video game, Dishonored does something fascinating. It links your use of violence to the spread and impact of the plague. In short, the more bodies you leave lying around, the more rats that will be attracted out from the shadows, and as a consequence, the greater the number of people that will ultimately be infected with the plague. Mechanically, this provides an interesting challenge, perhaps to counterbalance the perceived ease of just killing enemies as opposed to seeking non-lethal means, meaning that there are literal consequences for not thinking through your actions and exploring the multiple routes and methods available. But the fun part for me is to try and understand what this mechanic is trying to tell us. What can we infer from violence that creates more suffering? Let's have a chat through some possibilities, shall we? Because I don't know the answers, but it's fun to explore. Firstly, those that become infected by the rat plague do not simply become sick and die, but instead go through a phase where they become little more than a zombie, known in the game as a weeper due to the way the blood seeps from the eyes during this period. These pitiful creatures wail and cry, attacking anyone that passes by, attempting to infect them out of some primal drive inherent to the disease, becoming both figures of pity and disgust. The simple fact is that when you find these weepers, they're pretty much always in the alleyways, slums, or abandoned buildings of the poorer neighbourhoods. This can be explained quite simply by 3 truths that are evident in the game. Firstly, the plague can spread through various methods, but primarily it is tied to the spread of rats in the environment, which rely on food sources, such as recently murdered corpses for example, being left out where they can find them. We know from dialogue in the Knife of Dunwall DLC that the wealthy pay for the city guard to make regular sweeps of their neighbourhoods, which would clear away anything likely to attract rats, but would also kill any weepers or rat swarms they came across. This is a form of privilege not experienced by your average citizen, who is just as likely to find bodies from richer estates dumped in their streets as to find one that fell there itself. Secondly, higher densities of population will always facilitate transmission of disease, and population density will generally be higher in poorer neighbourhoods. The only medical protection available to help protect from the plague is a short-term vaccine produced either by Anton Sokolov or Piero Joplin, both of which require regular doses to avoid infection. However, this elixir is sold privately rather than administered by the state, and is often referred to by citizens as being overpriced. In fact, the only person that seems to make any attempt to increase the accessibility of the elixir is the gang leader of the Bottle Street gang, Slackjaw, who begins selling a cheaper, watered-down version of the elixir out of their distillery. Ordinary people can simply not afford the very thing that they need to be protected. So we now understand why it is the poorer residents that suffer disproportionately. But there is of course more to it than that. Whilst it was always quite likely that an outbreak of an infectious disease would be likely to take hold in the poorer, overcrowded areas of Dunwall, this plague was in fact a weapon of class war.
Suspects? What? Suspects? We ain't gonna waste time solving who killed him. Personally, I'd buy who did it a drink.
But what are you gonna put on your report?
I'm gonna say we found one of Slackjaw's men inside, all dead and bloody, and that you are a stinking idiot.
It is discovered that Hiram Burrows is the one responsible for bringing the disease-carrying bull rats to Dunwall, and having deliberately placed them in the poorest areas of the city in an attempt at a sort of poverty genocide that would appear to the wider realm as a tragedy but not a criminal act. The disease, however, quickly spread beyond the areas that Burrows intended, and grew out of control due to the then Empress Jessamine Caldwin's reluctance to employ robust quarantine measures early on. Once the Empress was removed, Burrows instigated martial law and had Sokolov's Tesla-like wall of light gates placed at regular intervals to stop the movement of people and contain the disease. Primarily poor people, we should point out. If we consider that the rats and the plague are an extension of class war, and that Corvo's violence can exacerbate that circumstance, it could be seen that the developers are telling us that violence is not always the correct response to violence. Given that the journey of the game is to depose the wrong leaders and replace them with the correct leaders, this could be seen as a liberal stance on power, maintaining the status quo, but seeking incremental changes through the election of the right people in the right places is quite a popular liberal trope, and indeed things like Harry Potter and Game of Thrones are a good example of this way of thinking. Bran indeed. We could consider that the majority of enemies you encounter in game are of the lower classes too, simply doing a job in return for access to the vaccine. and that by violently dispatching them, you are in fact providing more lower class victims of the higher class's power struggle. However, most of them are effectively cops, using violence in a time of almost universal suffering to contain, punish and hurt ordinary people that are rightly afraid and abandoned. So I'm not sure how much truck I have with that particular line of thought. The other possible thematic element behind the way the Plague Rats respond to violence is perhaps to teach that revenge is a selfish motive, and that in simply killing everyone in your path, you are damning the rest of the city to suffer an even greater extent. It could be seen as a criticism of selfish motivations for power, and that acting in what is your own interest at the expense of others creates a shockwave that creates further chaos and tension for the world around you. Not thinking of the consequences of your actions can lead to bad results. This would be further reinforced by the fates of the Loyalist leadership, who all end up betraying those around them and each other in an attempt to scramble to the top and rule as regent. These actions had little to do with helping the people of Dunwall, and everything to do with what they considered their rightful place at the top of the pyramid, whilst also confirming they wanted the pyramid to still exist underneath them. Perhaps the thematic element I am grasping with is just that the lust for power causes people to forget why they were given power in the first place, and it is only by retaining a respect for life, all life, that a society can function. I hope so. This is the best and most optimistic read of the chaos mechanic that I can think of at the moment, at least. And whilst it doesn't placate my wish for there to have been a more radical and structurally significant ending to the first game, it is perhaps more soothing than the right person in charge will solve all our problems approach, so common in liberal and fascist political visions. I did want to quickly mention the other visible impact of your actions in-game, which is the behaviour of Corvo's daughter and heir, Emily, who becomes increasingly morbid and cutthroat if you kill and maim your way through missions, but who can remain relatively innocent and kind if you choose a gentler path. For me, Emily acts as a sort of surrogate for the people of Dunwall and the wider empire, internalising the logic and behaviours of her surviving parent, with them shaping the leader she will one day become. Indeed, should you go the high chaos route, murdering those around you willy-nilly, Emily will remark something along the lines of, "When I am Empress, I would have had them all killed anyway." Perhaps society will see how you murdered your way through Dunwall, and likewise react with violence, callousness, and a look after your own interest philosophy. Thinking about your actions, and how it can affect those around you, would seemingly be a large part of the message. There is a lot to consider, and apart from being a captivating game mechanic, the link between the plague and your violence does create a space for thinking about consequences, even if limited by the outcomes available to a game that is now over 10 years old.
As a reminder that collective bargaining in any industry deemed vital to the state is a capital offense. These include metallurgy, whale collection and refinement, security services, and selected legal and clerical specializations. Consult the city barrister for clarification and enforcement.
Dishonored is a game that exists in a world of its own creation, populated by many weird and wonderful characters, with it being both a steampunk dystopian nightmare and a fantastical vision of the magical world of mystery, possibility and exploration. Arcane clearly cared about this setting, such is the level of depth, detail and imagination in its DNA. And my experiences with the sequels really illustrate a love for this world and its characters, with them interwoven from the first game, through the DLCs and into the sequels. Everything feels significant. Every location, every technology, every graffitied scrawl has a story, a purpose and a flavour it is adding to the wider piece. Whenever I find myself playing a game with an original setting like this, I find myself drawn to trying to understand how it all works. What is the politics of this world? What is the economy? What is the history? What are its cultures? How does it all weave together to make this reality? Most of the time, I am ultimately looking for info that just isn't there. Game developers will rarely map out how a Victorian-era steampunk Western nation would fund its economy, further than just putting some miscellaneous factories in or referring to a king or queen in charge of things. Dishonored, however, maps out a power struggle. It talks of imports and exports, of relationships and historical struggles, of mysteries, and of legend. Most importantly though, it demonstrates how class interests can override allegiances, can undermine institutions, and can usurp governments. That being said, as someone with left-wing political views, I remain frustrated that my only option is to return an heir to the head of a colonial empire, and hope that she will govern well for the people. Storytelling where the solutions and heroes are not predestined, class-based or fatalised in some way remains a relatively rare phenomena, and this is something I may explore in a future video. However, despite all this, I love these games and this setting. Even after 10 years, it is absolutely still a worthy playing experience if you haven't tried it before, and it remains one of the best examples of world building out there. The Dishonored series is a labour of love. You can tell Arcane really cared about this world, imbuing it with so much character and depth, and allowing you to fully explore it, to open every drawer, to find every secret entrance, to interrogate the truth behind every character. At a time where the AAA video game industry seems hell-bent on offering only live service, microtransaction-ridden multiplayers designed around extraction and addiction behaviours, I think we should all look to what is possible when deep storytelling is allowed to thrive, and to reject the shallow slot machines offered by the likes of EA, Blizzard and Ubisoft. Demand better. Firstly, can I just thank all those who maintain the Dishonored wiki. It has proven an essential resource with so much depth and variety of sources that this video would have been a shadow of itself without all this information. Likewise, a fair way into writing the script for this video, I stumbled onto Maris Crane's various articles on Dishonored, and they are all worth a read. See the links in the description. She makes some very insightful comments that very much added to my understanding of the game, and rather amusingly had pulled the same Sokolov and Emily conversation as I had earlier in the video. The passion of people like the contributors on the wiki and freelance writers like Maris Crane are inspiring and make me want to do more of these media-based video essays, and I already have my eye on another one. Lastly, I wanted to thank Nothing Corporate 2, who has provided me with a whole bunch of insightful feedback and advice on how to improve my channel, which has proven invaluable to my efforts and drives me to keep improving. And thank you for watching right till the end. Please give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want more content like this. Look after each other out there, comrades, and remember, a kind heart is more convincing than any book or speech. Goodbye.